The streets of New York in the 1920s were a symphony of chaos and opportunity, a city pulsing with ambition, vice, and danger. Immigrants flooded the neighborhoods, seeking the American dream, yet many found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of poverty, violence, and corruption. In this environment, the line between survival and crime blurred, and the young, ruthless, and cunning could rise faster than the law could contain them. It was here, in the gritty, unforgiving neighborhoods of Manhattan, that Salvatore Lucania, who the world would later know as Lucky Luciano, first learned the rules of the street, the rules that would make him untouchable. From a young age, Luciano observed the intricate dance of power around him. He watched men negotiate alliances with the precision of chess masters, saw the deadly consequences of betrayal, and understood that fear and respect were currency in equal measure. The chaos of the streets became his classroom, the violence around him a masterclass in human psychology. While other boys might have been drawn into petty theft or juvenile mischief without purpose, Luciano absorbed every lesson with the mind of a strategist, calculating each move before he made it. He learned that intelligence and foresight could achieve what brute force never could. By the time he reached adolescence, Luciano was no ordinary street kid. His charm, quick wit, and innate ability to read people set him apart. He had an uncanny talent for identifying who could be a potential ally, who could be manipulated, and who was a threat that needed to be neutralized before it became dangerous. He was observing the anatomy of the underworld before he had even stepped fully into it. It was this combination of environmental pressure, raw ambition, and extraordinary mental acuity that would allow him to rise above the chaos of the streets and outthink men who were larger, stronger, and already entrenched in power. New York itself seemed to conspire to create figures like Luciano. The Prohibition era had transformed the city into a sprawling playground for organized crime. Bootlegging, gambling, and vice became massive, highly profitable industries, controlled not by amateurs but by seasoned criminals who understood both risk and reward. Yet, even in this world of established mobsters, corruption, and violence, Luciano would stand out, not because he was the most brutal but because he was the smartest. He understood that raw power could be fleeting, but strategy, influence, and alliances could make a man untouchable. This is the story of a man who would bend the rules of crime to his favor, who would take the disarray of the underworld and turn it into a structured empire, and who would walk a razor's edge between legality, loyalty, and mortal danger. Lucky Luciano was not merely a gangster. He was a visionary, a master strategist operating in the shadows of a city that never slept, a man whose mind was as sharp and lethal as any weapon he wielded. His life would be a story of contrasts, charisma and cruelty, loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability. And it all began in these streets, where every corner held a lesson, every shadow a threat, and every encounter a test of intellect and nerve. By understanding the world Luciano emerged from, we begin to see why he was different, why he would rise above his peers, and why his story continues to captivate generations. He was a product of his time but also a man ahead of it, someone who could read the currents of human behavior and bend them to his will. In a city built on dreams and blood, Lucky Luciano would learn that intelligence and strategy were the ultimate weapons, and that the streets that had shaped him could also elevate him to untouchable heights. The streets of Hell's Kitchen in the early 1900s were unforgiving, a place where every day was a struggle for survival and every corner whispered danger. Italian immigrants poured into the city in search of a better life, but instead of opportunity, many found overcrowded tenements, unpaved streets, and a world ruled by the ruthless. Among them was the young Salvatore Lucania, who would later become known as Lucky Luciano. Born into a working-class family, his earliest memories were of the narrow alleys, the noisy marketplaces, and the constant tension that hung in the air. Poverty was pervasive and violence was almost routine. Arguments could turn into street brawls and small thefts were often punished with more than just a slap on the wrist. Luciano's family struggled to make ends meet. His father worked tirelessly trying to provide for the household, while his mother did her best to shield her children from the harsh realities outside their door. But in a neighborhood like Hell's Kitchen, shielding children from danger was nearly impossible. Young Salvatore watched, often in silent fascination, as men used intimidation, cunning, and occasionally brute force to carve out a place for themselves in the world. He observed how power was negotiated, how loyalty could be bought or broken, and how fear was often the most effective form of control. These early lessons were seared into his mind, forming the blueprint of the man he would become. School offered little escape. While he was bright and quick-witted, the educational environment could not compete with the street's harsh lessons. Gangs of older boys patrolled the blocks, and joining them, or at least learning their codes, was almost a rite of passage for survival. Luciano learned early to read people, to anticipate threats before they materialized, and to project confidence even when he felt none. He quickly realized that physical strength alone was not enough. Intelligence, observation, and timing could level the playing field. The streets were a battlefield where strategy mattered as much as muscle, and Luciano was a student of both. But it wasn't just violence that shaped him. He witnessed the resilience of the immigrant community, the camaraderie among families and neighbors who looked out for each other, and the subtle ways people manipulated the system to survive. He saw shopkeepers negotiating with gangsters to keep their businesses safe, he saw street kids hustling for nickels and dimes, and he understood that survival often required bending the rules without breaking them completely. Every interaction, every transaction, every conflict was a lesson in human nature, and Luciano absorbed them all with an almost uncanny attention to detail. By his teenage years, Luciano was already testing the limits of his intelligence and daring. He began running small errands for local criminals, observing their operations, and learning the delicate balance between fear and respect. Unlike many street kids who fell into petty crime blindly, he approached every act with calculation, always asking himself what advantage it could bring him in the future. It was during these years that his understanding of power, loyalty, and betrayal truly began to crystallize. He learned who could be trusted, who could be manipulated, and who would eventually have to be outmaneuvered. The environment of Hell's Kitchen was harsh, but it also honed a particular skill set. Luciano learned to control his emotions in dangerous situations, to anticipate aggression, and to remain calm when chaos erupted around him. He discovered early that showing fear or hesitation could be fatal, while projecting confidence, even if only a mask, earned respect and sometimes allegiance. These formative experiences created a psychological armor that would serve him throughout his life, allowing him to operate in a world where trust was rare and survival depended on perception as much as action. Through these early years, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano developed the tools that would later allow him to rise above the street-level chaos and transform organized crime. He understood the importance of timing, of alliances, and of reading the human heart. In the unforgiving crucible of Hell's Kitchen, intelligence became his greatest weapon, observation his shield, and ambition his fuel. By the time he was ready to step fully into the underworld, Luciano was not only prepared, he was primed to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast anyone who underestimated him. The streets had forged him, sharpened him, and given him a vision far beyond the narrow alleys of his childhood, a vision that would reshape the criminal world forever. By the time Salvatore Lucania entered his mid-teens, the boy from Hell's Kitchen had already begun navigating the shadowy edges of New York's criminal underworld. What had started as small survival schemes, running errands, collecting debts, and observing the neighborhood gangs, soon evolved into something more calculated and ambitious. Luciano was no longer just a spectator of street life. He was beginning to understand the mechanics of power, the subtle language of threat and persuasion, and the way influence could be leveraged. Every interaction became a lesson in strategy, every confrontation a test of wit and nerve. His first steps into organized crime were measured, cautious, and deliberate. Luciano associated himself with minor racketeers and small-time operators, learning their operations, noting weaknesses, and quietly imagining how he could do things differently, better. Unlike many young men of his age who relied solely on brute force, Luciano relied on observation, intellect, and psychological insight. He watched the older criminals carefully, noting how respect could be commanded without violence, how loyalty could be extracted with subtle incentives, and how fear, when applied judiciously, could control even the most obstinate rivals. It was in these formative years that Luciano began to develop the signature trait that would define his rise, the ability to outthink his enemies before confronting them. Luciano's intelligence was complemented by a rare adaptability. He could shift his persona to fit any situation, presenting himself as charming and cooperative when alliances were needed, or cold and intimidating when confrontation was inevitable. This fluidity allowed him to gain trust, infiltrate networks, and observe operations from the inside, all while remaining largely untouchable. He became known for his calm demeanor, even in the most dangerous circumstances, and for an uncanny ability to anticipate moves before others could act. Where other young gangsters might have sought glory in reckless violence, Luciano sought information, connections, and opportunity. These early ventures also exposed him to the hierarchy of New York's criminal world. He saw firsthand how power was distributed not by sheer strength, but by organization, intelligence, and the ability to manipulate perception. Petty gangsters ran local territories with brute force, but their empires were fragile, vulnerable to betrayal or law enforcement pressure. Luciano recognized that survival and growth depended not on individual heroics but on building networks, establishing systems of loyalty, and maintaining an image of untouchability. This insight would become the cornerstone of his later empire, setting him apart from the chaotic, often self-destructive gangs around him. During this time he also forged critical early alliances that would shape his trajectory. He met figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, men who shared his vision for a more structured, strategic approach to crime. These relationships were not merely friendships. They were deliberate partnerships built on mutual ambition and complementary skills. Luciano understood that intelligence alone was insufficient. Influence and protection required allies who were equally calculating, ruthless, and loyal. Together they began to conceptualize a new model of organized crime, one that treated illegal enterprises with the precision and discipline of legitimate business. But Luciano's rise was not without peril. The streets were a constant reminder that miscalculation could be fatal. Rival gangs, territorial disputes, and law enforcement posed persistent threats. Every minor misstep could trigger violent retaliation or draw unwanted attention. Yet even in these moments, Luciano demonstrated remarkable composure. He learned to navigate danger not with impulsive aggression, but with foresight, patience, and tactical negotiation. This ability to remain calm under pressure, to calculate risks, and to manipulate outcomes would define his career and distinguish him from the countless ambitious street kids who faltered before reaching adulthood. By the end of his teenage years, Luciano had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with in the lower ranks of the criminal world. He was respected, feared, and quietly admired for his intelligence, charisma, and strategic mind. The boy who had roamed the alleys of Hell's Kitchen was transforming into a man capable of reshaping the underworld itself. The chaotic environment of his youth, once a crucible of fear and deprivation, had become his training ground. Every street corner, every hustler, every violent encounter had contributed to a growing understanding of power, loyalty, and strategy. Luciano was no longer merely surviving. He was preparing to dominate. These formative years were critical not only for the development of his skills but also for the construction of his psychological framework. Luciano understood the necessity of balance. When to charm, when to intimidate, when to observe, and when to strike. He had learned that power was ephemeral without strategy, that fear could enforce obedience but not loyalty, and that alliances were only as strong as the mutual benefit they provided. This nuanced understanding of human behavior, coupled with his extraordinary ambition, set the stage for his next phase, the deliberate, calculated rise into the heart of New York's organized crime, where his intellect would outmatch brute force and his strategic vision would redefine the mafia forever. By the early 1920s, Salvatore Lucania had moved beyond the streets of Hell's Kitchen and was beginning to assert himself in the broader criminal networks of New York. What distinguished him from his peers was not just his ambition but his uncanny ability to see the bigger picture, the intricate web of relationships, rivalries, and opportunities that defined the underworld. While many gangsters relied on fear and brute force alone, Luciano approached every move with calculation, analyzing the balance of power and predicting the likely reactions of allies and enemies alike. His mind operated like a strategist's chessboard, where each decision could determine survival, influence, or supremacy. Luciano's rise was rooted in his ability to forge alliances that others overlooked. He recognized early that brute power alone could never sustain an empire. To dominate the criminal world, one needed allies who were not just strong but intelligent, ambitious, and loyal. He cultivated relationships with figures such as Meyer Lansky, whose financial acumen complemented Luciano's strategic genius, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, whose charisma and boldness made him an invaluable operative. These partnerships were meticulously chosen, each relationship carefully nurtured to ensure mutual benefit and long-term stability. Luciano understood the psychology of loyalty, knowing that respect and opportunity often outweighed fear in cementing allegiance. At the same time, Luciano began to expand his influence within established gangs. He worked methodically to place himself in positions where he could observe and learn from older, more experienced criminals, taking mental notes of their strengths and weaknesses. He studied the patterns of rival factions, identified gaps in their operations, and began to insert himself into roles where he could manipulate outcomes without drawing direct attention. By leveraging intellect over aggression, Luciano created the illusion of compliance while subtly consolidating power, ensuring that when the time came to strike, he would do so from a position of strength. This period also marked the development of his unique understanding of timing and opportunity. Luciano knew that ambition without patience was reckless, and that decisive action required preparation. He observed how other criminals rushed into conflicts, squandered opportunities, and drew unwanted attention from law enforcement, often leading to their downfall. In contrast, Luciano cultivated a long-term perspective. He measured risk, anticipated rivals' reactions, and waited for the precise moment when moves could yield maximum gain. This patience, combined with his tactical intelligence, allowed him to rise while others stumbled, often without the public realizing the extent of his influence until it was too late. Luciano's ability to read people was equally critical to his ascent. He possessed an extraordinary talent for identifying motivations, weaknesses, and desires, and he used this knowledge to manipulate situations to his advantage. Whether negotiating alliances, mediating disputes, or planning criminal ventures, he could anticipate reactions and adjust his strategy accordingly. This skill was not merely instinctual, it was honed through years of observation, trial, and error on the streets. It allowed him to build networks of trust and influence that were resilient, adaptive, and capable of weathering the turbulent criminal landscape of Prohibition-era New York. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was no longer just a participant in organized crime. He was a strategist shaping its trajectory. He orchestrated alliances between rival factions, mediating disputes with a combination of tact and intimidation. He began to introduce the concept of collective governance among gangs, laying the groundwork for what would later become the Mafia Commission, a council to regulate crime, resolve disputes, and enforce agreements. Even at this early stage, his vision extended beyond personal gain. He sought to structure the underworld in a way that minimized conflict and maximized profit, a revolutionary approach that challenged the traditional reliance on violence and fear alone. The streets, the alleys, and the smoky backrooms of New York became his classroom, and every encounter was a lesson in strategy. He learned to weigh trust against opportunity, to balance risk with reward, and to measure loyalty against ambition. His alliances were never merely tactical, they were carefully engineered extensions of his vision for control and dominance. Even when surrounded by older, more established figures, Luciano's intelligence and foresight allowed him to influence decisions subtly, guiding the course of events in ways that favored his ascent. During this transformative period, Luciano's reputation began to spread. He was known not just for his audacity, but for his ingenuity and reliability. Allies trusted him to act decisively, while rivals regarded him with a mixture of caution and unease. He became a figure who could negotiate peace between feuding factions, manipulate the outcomes of criminal ventures, and predict shifts in power that others failed to see. This growing reputation was both protective and strategic. It discouraged aggression against him while establishing him as a key figure in the evolving underworld hierarchy. Ultimately, this phase of Luciano's life set the stage for the true consolidation of power. He had learned the importance of patience, the value of alliances, and the necessity of psychological insight. More than anything, he had discovered that to rise above the chaos of the streets and the volatility of criminal networks, he would need to combine intellect with ambition, strategy with opportunity, and loyalty with calculated manipulation. It was this combination that would allow him to move from a street-smart youth to the architect of a criminal empire, outmaneuvering rivals and outthinking adversaries in ways that would redefine organized crime in America forever. By the late 1920s, Luciano had begun not merely to participate in organized crime but to redefine it. The old ways, loose networks of gangs ruled by brute strength and impulsive violence, were insufficient for the scale of operations he envisioned. He recognized that true power required structure, discipline, and a framework that could endure beyond the lifespan of any single man. It was in this period that Luciano began to organize the mafia with the precision of a corporate executive, transforming chaotic street gangs into a streamlined, highly efficient enterprise. The streets that had once been unpredictable battlegrounds now became territories in which he could exert influence through careful planning and psychological control. Central to this transformation was the idea of the mafia as a system rather than a collection of individuals. Luciano understood that loyalty alone was fragile. Without rules, even the most devoted associates could betray you if the opportunity presented itself. Drawing on lessons from his early years and insights gained from his alliances with Lansky, Siegel, and other forward-thinking criminals, he began to introduce a hierarchy, defined roles, and systems of accountability. Operations were compartmentalized, responsibilities clearly assigned, and lines of communication formalized. In effect, Luciano was building a criminal enterprise that mirrored legitimate business structures, with the added advantage of secrecy and ruthlessness. The concept of the commission emerged from this vision. Luciano realized that conflict between rival families weakened all parties and drew unwanted attention from law enforcement. By establishing a council where disputes could be mediated, profits could be shared fairly, and codes of conduct could be enforced, he minimized unnecessary violence while maximizing efficiency and revenue. This innovation marked a radical departure from the old-school approach to organized crime, which relied almost exclusively on personal dominance and intimidation. Through the commission, Luciano introduced the idea that crime could be managed like a strategic enterprise, where negotiation, diplomacy, and planning mattered as much as aggression. Luciano also understood the psychological dimension of this restructuring. He was keenly aware that control over people required more than rules. It demanded respect, fear, and trust in equal measure. Leaders who ruled solely through terror were vulnerable to rebellion, while those who relied only on camaraderie were easily manipulated. Luciano struck a balance, cultivating loyalty through rewards and protection while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty. This dual approach reinforced his authority and created a culture in which the mafia operated with discipline, even under the threat of violence. He transformed chaos into predictability without sacrificing the ruthless efficiency that made the organization feared. The operational innovations extended to every aspect of criminal enterprise. Luciano's system ensured that no single individual controlled too much, reducing risk and preventing internal power struggles from destabilizing the organization. He introduced protocols for money laundering, gambling, extortion, and bootlegging, creating a network that could survive setbacks, law enforcement pressure, and the ambitions of rival factions. The empire he envisioned was not just a collection of illicit activities. It was a living, adaptive machine capable of generating vast wealth while maintaining order. Moreover, Luciano's emphasis on structure allowed him to scale operations beyond the neighborhoods of Manhattan. By imposing order, he could integrate previously rival gangs into a broader network, turning potential enemies into collaborators. His ability to negotiate alliances, mediate conflicts, and align interests under a unified vision elevated him above the ordinary gangster. Where others saw chaos and violence as inevitable, Luciano saw opportunity, strategy, and a path to enduring power. Psychologically, this period of organization revealed Luciano's genius. He was not content with being merely a powerful mobster. He sought to institutionalize influence. By codifying behavior, enforcing discipline, and creating mechanisms for arbitration, he reduced the unpredictability that had claimed so many lives in the underworld. His approach combined pragmatism with insight into human behavior, showing that power derived as much from perception, manipulation, and foresight as from weapons or intimidation. Associates came to rely on him not just for protection but for guidance, seeing him as a figure whose vision could secure their future as much as their present. The reorganization of the mafia also cemented Luciano's reputation as a man ahead of his time. Rivals often underestimated him because they equated power with physical dominance, failing to grasp the intellectual strategy that underpinned his actions. Allies, on the other hand, recognized the opportunity in aligning with a mind that could orchestrate such a complex enterprise. Through this combination of structure, foresight, and psychological mastery, Luciano created an environment where the organization could thrive, expand, and outlast the unpredictable violence that had previously defined organized crime. By the end of this period, it was clear that Luciano's innovations had changed the game forever. The mafia was no longer simply a network of territorial gangs. It was an organized, disciplined, and strategically managed enterprise. This transformation reflected not just his intelligence, but his understanding of human behavior, social dynamics, and the delicate balance between loyalty and fear. Luciano had become more than a gangster. He had become a strategist, a visionary, and an architect of power, capable of bending an entire criminal ecosystem to his will. Central to the structure that Lucky Luciano built was not just the architecture of the mafia, but the invisible rules that governed behavior within it, the unspoken yet unbreakable code known as Omerta. This code was more than a set of guidelines. It was a psychological framework, a system of loyalty, fear, and honor that defined every interaction within the criminal world. To outsiders, it appeared as silence and secrecy, but beneath that surface was a complex moral universe, one in which trust, betrayal, and respect were currency, and one misstep could be fatal. Luciano understood this code instinctively and used it to both protect himself and manipulate those around him, turning human behavior into a strategic tool. Omerta demanded obedience, discretion, and unwavering loyalty. For Luciano, these principles were not simply about enforcing rules. They were about creating a predictable, controllable environment in which he could exercise influence. He knew that fear alone could command obedience temporarily, but respect and perceived fairness ensured loyalty over the long term. By balancing intimidation with rewards, Luciano cultivated a culture where associates followed directives not just because they had to, but because they recognized the consequences of defiance and the benefits of alignment. The psychological mastery inherent in Omerta allowed him to operate an empire with minimal internal conflict, even as he wielded absolute authority. At the same time, the code emphasized the inescapable consequences of betrayal. In a world where the law was often unpredictable, Omerta functioned as an internal justice system, ensuring that those who broke trust paid the ultimate price. Luciano was adept at leveraging this principle. He used the threat of reprisal strategically, knowing that fear could reinforce loyalty more effectively than coercion alone. But he also understood the nuances. Punishment had to be measured, visible enough to serve as an example, yet discreet enough to maintain cohesion. This delicate balance required a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, and Luciano executed it with near perfection. Omerta also shaped the moral universe within which Luciano and his associates operated. Unlike conventional law, it was a morality dictated by survival, loyalty, and hierarchy. Every decision carried weight, and every action had consequences within the tightly knit web of relationships that defined the Mafia. Luciano recognized that humans were motivated by a mix of self-interest, fear, and ambition, and he structured the code to exploit these drives. He could reward compliance, incentivize cooperation, and, when necessary, punish transgression in ways that reinforced his authority and safeguarded the organization. In this sense, Omerta was both a shield and a weapon, a social contract that guaranteed order amidst chaos. The psychological influence of Omerta extended beyond the immediate members of the organization. Rival factions, law enforcement officials, and even political figures learned to respect the implicit rules that governed the Mafia. The code created predictability in an otherwise volatile environment. It allowed outsiders to understand the boundaries of engagement, reducing unnecessary conflict and increasing strategic control. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to manipulate both sides of the equation. He enforced the code internally while projecting power externally, cultivating an image of omniscience and untouchability that deterred challenges before they arose. Within this moral and psychological framework, Luciano also mastered the art of perception. Associates were encouraged to believe in the inviolability of the code, yet he knew that real control came from understanding the human element: ego, ambition, fear, and desire. He cultivated loyalty through incentives, offered protection to those who complied, and subtly exposed vulnerabilities to those who faltered. The code was never static. It was a living system, flexible enough to accommodate negotiation and strategy, but rigid enough to maintain order and obedience. By embedding his leadership in this duality, Luciano ensured that his influence extended far beyond mere intimidation, creating a psychological hierarchy that was as powerful as any weapon. Moreover, the code shaped the culture of the Mafia in a way that allowed Luciano to scale his operations. By instilling a shared set of values and expectations, he could integrate new members, resolve internal disputes, and maintain control across a sprawling network of families and territories. Omerta became the glue that held the organization together, transforming what could have been a collection of violent, short-sighted gangs into a disciplined, interconnected empire. The psychological depth of this system reflected Luciano's understanding that true power required more than wealth or muscle. It required the ability to manipulate human behavior, predict actions, and enforce loyalty with subtle, strategic precision. Through the application of Omerta, Luciano not only solidified his internal authority but also projected an aura of inevitability to the outside world. Enemies feared retribution, allies trusted his judgment, law enforcement struggled to infiltrate his operations. Every action reinforced the perception that he was untouchable, not merely because of physical force, but because of his mastery over human psychology and social dynamics. In this way, the code was a tool of empire building, shaping both the moral and strategic landscape of organized crime. Ultimately, Omerta was more than a rulebook. It was a manifestation of Luciano's mind. It reflected his understanding that human behavior could be systematized, leveraged, and manipulated to create order from chaos. By combining loyalty, fear, and moral psychology, he engineered a framework that enabled him to dominate the criminal world without constant brute force. The code became a lens through which every decision, every alliance, and every act of intimidation or diplomacy was filtered, allowing Luciano to control not just territory but people, the true currency of power. Through this understanding of human nature and discipline, he laid the foundation for an empire that was as psychologically sophisticated as it was financially lucrative, and for the first time, the American Mafia had a leader who could command obedience and respect through intellect as much as through force. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had not only mastered the psychological architecture of the Mafia but had begun to expand his empire into a sprawling network of illicit enterprises. The streets that had once taught him the rules of survival had now become his playground for strategy, power, and influence. Luciano understood that control over territory was only part of the equation. Real dominance required control over the flow of money, people, and opportunity. To achieve this, he began meticulously identifying allies who could strengthen his position and rivals whose weaknesses could be exploited. Every alliance was calculated, every friendship measured against loyalty, and every potential betrayal anticipated. This was the chessboard on which he moved, and Luciano had an unmatched ability to see several moves ahead. His early alliances were strategic and often surprising. Men who were once enemies could be turned into allies with careful negotiation, and the most obstinate rivals could be neutralized without unnecessary bloodshed. Luciano's partnerships with figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel exemplified this approach. Lansky's brilliance in finance and Siegel's audacious charisma complemented Luciano's strategic mind, creating a triad of influence that allowed them to dominate New York's criminal operations. These alliances were not just business arrangements. They were psychological networks, bound by mutual ambition, calculated loyalty, and shared vision. Each partner knew their role, their worth, and the consequences of disloyalty. Luciano's genius lay in creating an ecosystem where loyalty was incentivized, betrayal punished, and ambition harnessed toward a collective goal. The criminal enterprises under Luciano's influence were vast and diverse. Bootlegging, still highly lucrative in the Prohibition era, provided the initial foundation, but Luciano quickly understood that diversification was key to stability and growth. Gambling operations, labor rackets, extortion, and illegal lotteries became part of a carefully orchestrated portfolio. Each venture was managed with precision, overseen by trusted lieutenants who reported directly to him. Unlike many contemporaries who ran their operations haphazardly, Luciano approached crime like a business, analyzing markets, anticipating risks, and maximizing profit. Every dollar earned was a tool for influence, every successful operation a demonstration of power, and every setback an opportunity to learn and adapt. Yet wealth and enterprise were only one part of the puzzle. Influence over people was the other. Luciano excelled at reading human behavior, understanding the ambitions, fears, and desires of his associates and rivals alike. He used this knowledge to forge alliances, manipulate situations, and neutralize threats before they could escalate. In a world where violence was often the first resort, Luciano's psychological insight allowed him to achieve objectives without unnecessary confrontation. He understood that a strategically placed ally, a well-timed threat, or a subtle act of intimidation could achieve far more than a hail of bullets ever could. As his empire expanded, so did the network of rivals and potential betrayals. The criminal underworld was a volatile landscape, where alliances were fragile and loyalty was constantly tested. Yet Luciano's combination of strategic acumen and psychological control allowed him to navigate these dangers with remarkable skill. Rival gangs learned to respect him not only because of his capacity for violence, but because of his ability to foresee moves, manipulate outcomes, and consolidate power efficiently. Even when tensions rose, he often defused them through negotiation, foresight, or calculated displays of strength that reinforced his untouchable image. During this period, Luciano's operations became increasingly professionalized. Money was laundered through legitimate businesses, political connections were cultivated to shield operations from interference, and trusted lieutenants managed day-to-day activities while reporting key developments. He delegated authority carefully, ensuring that his direct influence remained strategic rather than operational. This allowed him to scale his empire without overextending himself, creating a model of organized crime that was both resilient and adaptive. By controlling not only resources but also information, Luciano maintained an unprecedented level of oversight and influence. Psychologically, this expansion reinforced Luciano's reputation as both brilliant and ruthless. Allies admired his vision, rivals feared his intelligence, and the public, often only glimpsing the sensational headlines, began to perceive him as untouchable. He understood that reputation itself was a form of currency. The perception of omnipotence often achieved more than actual power alone. Every operation, Every alliance and every calculated move contributed to the narrative that he was a master strategist, a man whose intellect could outmaneuver brute force and whose foresight could anticipate even the most cunning adversaries. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's empire was not merely a collection of criminal ventures. It was a highly organized, psychologically sophisticated network of influence. Allies knew their roles, rivals knew the risks of crossing him, and law enforcement struggled to penetrate the intricate web of loyalty, fear, and strategic manipulation he had constructed. He had created an environment in which power, wealth, and intelligence were intertwined, producing an organization capable of surviving setbacks, outmaneuvering rivals, and thriving under pressure. In the hidden corridors of backrooms, gambling dens, and smoky offices, Luciano's genius unfolded, calculated, precise, and unstoppable. This phase of his life demonstrates not only his ability to amass wealth but also his capacity to shape human behavior. The alliances he formed, the networks he built, and the psychological understanding he wielded were as important as any criminal enterprise he controlled. By combining intellect with audacity, loyalty with manipulation, and strategy with adaptability, Luciano transformed New York's underworld into a machine designed for dominance. He had become more than a gangster. He had become a master architect of power, a strategist whose understanding of human nature allowed him to command influence far beyond the reach of any conventional authority. Even as Lucky Luciano consolidated his empire, the criminal underworld of New York was far from stable. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, alliances were fragile, and law enforcement began to turn its attention toward the increasingly sophisticated operations of organized crime. The streets, once a playground for his early experiments in strategy and influence, became a dangerous chessboard where every miscalculation could have deadly consequences. Luciano understood that power alone could not guarantee survival. He needed to navigate the hidden war that unfolded behind closed doors, in smoky backrooms, and along the dimly lit alleys of the city. This was a war not always fought with guns, but with strategy, loyalty, and the subtle art of intimidation. The hidden war was composed of rival factions vying for control over lucrative operations such as bootlegging, gambling, and labor rackets. Territorial disputes often escalated into violence, yet Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to mediate and manipulate outcomes without unnecessary bloodshed. He used negotiation as a weapon, subtly sowing doubt among rivals while reinforcing loyalty among his allies. Through careful observation and strategic intervention, he often diffused conflicts before they erupted, positioning himself as both an arbiter and a threat. This approach not only preserved his empire but also allowed him to expand it, absorbing weaker factions and neutralizing threats in ways that appeared seamless to outsiders. Law enforcement posed an ever-present danger, yet even here Luciano demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. He cultivated political connections and exploited corruption within municipal and federal agencies, ensuring that his operations could function under a cloak of protection. Informants and bribed officials provided critical intelligence, allowing him to anticipate raids, investigations, and legal challenges. This intricate dance with law enforcement required constant vigilance and adaptability. A single lapse could expose his network, yet Luciano's foresight and meticulous planning minimized risk, allowing him to operate with a sense of invulnerability that only reinforced his growing legend. At the same time, internal threats demanded careful management. The very people who served his empire could become liabilities if their ambition outstripped their loyalty. Luciano's mastery of human psychology allowed him to detect subtle signs of dissent, greed, or fear before they escalated into danger. He employed a combination of rewards, persuasion, and calculated intimidation to maintain cohesion, ensuring that his associates understood both the benefits of loyalty and the costs of betrayal. By managing the internal dynamics of his organization with precision, he created a disciplined network capable of executing complex operations with remarkable efficiency. The hidden war also extended to public perception. Luciano understood the power of reputation, knowing that fear and respect could be more effective than overt violence. By cultivating an aura of invincibility, he deterred would-be challengers while reinforcing confidence among his allies. Stories of his ruthlessness, often exaggerated or strategically leaked, served as psychological leverage, shaping behavior even among those who had never encountered him directly. In this way, Luciano's control extended beyond direct action. He dominated the perception of power itself, turning rumor and reputation into strategic tools in the ongoing struggle for dominance. During this period, strategic alliances became even more critical. Luciano negotiated partnerships with other families and criminal enterprises, ensuring that conflicts were minimized and profits maximized. He understood that compromise, when executed from a position of strength, could be more advantageous than direct confrontation. By acting as a central node in a complex network of relationships, Luciano not only increased his influence but also ensured that rival factions were dependent on his guidance and judgment. His leadership became synonymous with stability and opportunity, drawing ambitious figures into his orbit while isolating potential threats. Violence remained a tool, but only a carefully calculated one. Hits were ordered with precision, targeting key threats without destabilizing the broader network. Assassinations and retributions were executed not in the heat of passion but as strategic maneuvers designed to maintain order and reinforce authority. This disciplined use of force distinguished Luciano from other gangsters of his era. While others relied on fear alone, he combined intellect, timing, and psychology to achieve results that were as effective as they were controlled. The hidden war was also a test of resilience. Every external threat and internal tension demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and innovation. Luciano's ability to anticipate moves, negotiate outcomes, and manipulate perceptions allowed him to survive crises that might have destroyed lesser figures. Whether navigating gang conflicts, political pressures, or law enforcement scrutiny, he consistently demonstrated a capacity for foresight and tactical brilliance that cemented his reputation as a strategist and a survivor. Through the orchestration of this hidden war, Luciano not only preserved his empire but expanded its reach and sophistication. He transformed New York's criminal underworld into a disciplined, interconnected network capable of weathering challenges, adapting to shifting dynamics and maximizing profit. By combining strategy, psychology, and ruthlessness, he created an organization that was more than a collection of criminal enterprises. It was a system of power, influence, and control that others struggled to comprehend. In navigating this complex and perilous landscape, Luciano revealed the full scope of his genius. The hidden war demonstrated his ability to operate simultaneously on multiple levels, managing rivals, motivating allies, manipulating law enforcement, and controlling public perception. He had become a figure whose intellect and foresight made him untouchable in a world defined by violence, ambition, and unpredictability. The battles fought in shadowed rooms and unmarked streets solidified his empire and prepared the stage for both his greatest triumphs and the vulnerabilities that would eventually test the limits of his power. Despite his careful planning, strategic brilliance, and near-untouchable reputation, Luciano's empire was not immune to the forces of law and fate. By the mid-1930s, the law was beginning to close in on him, fueled by relentless investigations, high-profile murders, and growing public outrage over the violent underworld he dominated. The very structures that had protected him, the loyalty of his associates, the fear of his rivals, and the intricate web of influence he had created, were now being tested against the unyielding machinery of the justice system. For the first time in his career, the calculated, untouchable strategist felt the weight of genuine vulnerability pressing upon him. The fall began subtly as cracks appeared in the empire he had meticulously constructed. Informants within his organization, pressured by law enforcement, began to reveal details of operations that had previously been shielded by Omerta. Rival factions, sensing an opportunity, began probing for weaknesses, testing loyalties, and challenging his authority in minor ways that could quickly escalate. Even allies, accustomed to protection, wealth, and carefully negotiated arrangements, grew cautious, aware that a single misstep could bring ruin. Luciano, who had always anticipated every possible outcome, now faced an unpredictable array of threats, both external and internal, that required immediate attention and unprecedented tactical maneuvering. It was during this period that the first signs of betrayal emerged in his closest circles. Associates who had long been loyal began to question their allegiances under pressure from law enforcement or enticed by personal gain. Luciano had always understood that loyalty was fragile, yet even he was surprised by the speed and subtlety with which trust could erode. The very mechanisms he had designed to enforce order and obedience, rewards, psychological manipulation, and the threat of punishment, were being undermined by relentless scrutiny and mounting legal pressure. In the shadows of the criminal empire, the seeds of his downfall were being planted, often by those who had once benefited most from his guidance and protection. The arrest of key lieutenants and the intensification of government scrutiny marked a turning point. Suddenly, operations that had seemed secure were exposed to legal vulnerability. Gambling dens, labor rackets, and bootlegging enterprises were raided, and evidence that would have been dismissed or concealed in earlier years now formed the basis of prosecution. The empire that Luciano had built on meticulous strategy, psychological control, and careful alliances was beginning to unravel under the combined pressures of law enforcement and human ambition. Each legal challenge, each betrayal, and each operational setback chipped away at the aura of invincibility that had once shielded him so effectively. Luciano's response to this mounting pressure was characteristic of his genius: methodical, calculating, and strategic. He sought to contain damage, realign loyal associates, and neutralize threats wherever possible. Yet even his best efforts could not fully prevent the encroachment of law. The machinery of justice, combined with the natural instability of human loyalty, created circumstances that even a man of his intelligence could not entirely control. What had always been a game of calculated risk now became a fight for survival, in which every move carried the possibility of permanent consequence. At the same time, the human cost of his empire became painfully apparent. Allies who had once been partners in ambition now faced imprisonment or worse, and rivals sensed the vulnerability that Luciano had rarely allowed to surface. The balance between fear and loyalty, which had been so carefully maintained for years, began to tip. Those who had been rewarded for obedience now considered self-preservation, and the invisible network of psychological control that had enforced discipline started to show cracks. The hidden war he had managed so brilliantly was transforming into an open struggle, in which strategy alone could not guarantee victory. Even as the net of law enforcement tightened, Luciano faced the personal realization that no empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, could entirely escape the consequences of its actions. He had built a world of wealth, power, and influence, but it existed on the edge of legality and morality. Every act of ambition, every calculated risk, had accumulated into a cumulative force capable of bringing him down. This awareness of vulnerability, a sensation he had rarely experienced, was psychologically destabilizing, forcing him to confront both the fragility of power and the limits of human foresight. The fall began not with dramatic violence but with the slow, grinding pressure of inevitability. Arrests, informants, betrayals, and law enforcement attention combined in a way that left Luciano vulnerable in ways that he had long anticipated but had never fully experienced. For the first time, the untouchable strategist realized that his empire, for all its sophistication, was subject to forces beyond his control: the relentless pursuit of justice, the ambitions of those within his own network, and the unpredictability of human behavior. These converging pressures marked the beginning of the end, setting the stage for a dramatic trial, a high-profile conviction, and the beginning of a personal and professional reckoning that would forever alter the trajectory of his life and empire. The trial of Lucky Luciano was unlike anything the city of New York had ever witnessed. Newspapers splashed his name across the front pages, sensationalizing every detail of his criminal empire, from bootlegging to labor rackets, painting him as both a public menace and a symbol of the untouchable power of organized crime. Courtrooms were packed with spectators eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had eluded the law for years, a figure whose reputation for intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma had grown almost mythic. From the outset, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a carefully staged spectacle, a theater in which Luciano's every move, every word, and every expression was scrutinized, debated, and dissected. The prosecution presented a meticulously crafted narrative, detailing Luciano's rise from the slums of Hell's Kitchen to the apex of New York's underworld. They portrayed him as a master manipulator, a strategist who orchestrated criminal enterprises with the precision of a corporate executive, yet who operated in open defiance of law and morality. Witnesses recounted extortion schemes, gambling operations, and violent reprisals, painting a vivid picture of an empire built on both cunning and terror. Each story, each piece of evidence, reinforced the image of Luciano as a man who had risen above his peers through intellect, audacity, and an unflinching disregard for the law. Yet the courtroom drama was not one-sided. Luciano's defense sought to humanize the man behind the legend. Lawyers argued that he was a product of his environment, a streetwise youth who had been forced to navigate a brutal and unforgiving world. They emphasized the loyalty he inspired, the discipline he instilled, and the strategic genius that allowed him to survive in a landscape dominated by violence and unpredictability. While the defense could not deny the facts of his operations, they aimed to frame Luciano as more than a criminal, portraying him as a complex figure shaped by circumstance, intelligence, and ambition. The media frenzy surrounding the trial heightened the stakes. Every hearing, every cross-examination, and every procedural motion became fodder for newspapers and radio broadcasts. The public consumed every detail, oscillating between fascination, fear, and outrage. For Luciano, The trial became a stage on which he could project control even in the face of overwhelming scrutiny. He appeared composed, calculating, and deliberate, understanding that perception was nearly as powerful as verdicts or evidence. His demeanor sent subtle messages to allies, rivals, and the authorities alike. He remained unbroken even when confronted by the full force of the law. Within the courtroom, tensions ran high as witnesses faced pressure, both overt and covert. Testimonies were complicated by fear, bribery, and intimidation, with some witnesses reluctant to fully disclose what they knew, while others were coerced into revealing critical information. Luciano had anticipated many of these scenarios, and his understanding of human psychology allowed him to manipulate the proceedings in subtle ways. He could exploit the hesitancy of witnesses, use body language to project authority, and leverage the complexity of the law to his advantage. Every maneuver was calculated to protect his empire, preserve influence, and maintain the illusion of control. As the trial progressed, the weight of evidence began to take its toll. Despite his strategic brilliance, Luciano could not entirely neutralize the legal machinery arrayed against him. Prosecutors painted a detailed picture of his empire, connecting the dots of criminal activity, alliances, and orchestration of violence in ways that made a compelling case to the jury. The sheer breadth of operations he controlled became a double-edged sword. While it demonstrated his genius and discipline, it also made his empire impossible to conceal. The court became the crucible in which the untouchable strategist would be tested not by rival gangs or street violence, but by the cold, deliberate procedures of law. Ultimately, the trial culminated in a sentence that shocked even seasoned observers. Luciano was convicted, his carefully constructed empire exposed to the harsh realities of legal accountability. The courtroom, once a stage for his charisma and psychological acumen, had transformed into the arena of his reckoning. The conviction marked a turning point, demonstrating that even the most cunning, disciplined, and strategic criminal could fall under the weight of law, betrayal, and circumstance. Yet even in defeat, Luciano's genius remained evident. He had navigated the trial with a level of calculation and composure that few could match, mitigating potential damage to his empire and preserving key alliances. The sentence, while punitive, did not entirely dismantle the network he had built. It merely altered the parameters within which it operated. From the confines of a courtroom and later prison, Luciano's influence would continue to reverberate, proving that true power was not confined to physical freedom but extended to perception, strategy, and the subtle management of loyalty and fear. The trial also left a lasting mark on public perception. To many, Luciano became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of genius. The courtroom proceedings revealed the intricate structure of organized crime, the psychological mastery required to maintain such an empire, and the inevitable vulnerabilities that even the most brilliant strategist could not escape. The trial, in essence, crystallized the duality of his legacy: a man capable of extraordinary strategic genius, yet ultimately subject to the same forces, law, betrayal, and mortality, that governed all human endeavor. In the end, the trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal event. It was a pivotal moment in the history of organized crime. It demonstrated the tension between intellect and authority, strategy and justice, and ambition and consequence. It forced Luciano, for the first time, to confront the fragility of even the most meticulously constructed empire, setting the stage for the next chapter of his life, one that would test his adaptability, resilience, and ability to wield power even from behind bars. Even behind the cold, iron bars of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence refused to wane. While many might have expected confinement to diminish his power, he approached incarceration as another battlefield, a place where intellect and psychological mastery could achieve what brute force alone could not. The prison walls, meant to isolate and neutralize him, became yet another arena in which he exercised control, turning limitations into opportunities and demonstrating once again why he had earned the reputation of being untouchable. From the outset, Luciano understood that the prison environment was a microcosm of the world he had mastered on the streets. Alliances, rivalries, and hierarchies existed within every wing, every cell block, and every interaction among inmates and guards alike. Those who underestimated him quickly learned the consequences. He observed human behavior with the same analytical precision he had applied to running his criminal empire, noting ambitions, fears, and weaknesses. By identifying key players, he could exert influence, broker arrangements, and manipulate both fellow inmates and prison staff to maintain order, secure privileges, and continue operating his network from within. Luciano's strategic approach to power in confinement relied heavily on relationships. He cultivated loyalty among inmates, rewarding those who aligned with him and subtly neutralizing potential threats. He negotiated with guards and officials, understanding that influence in this context could translate into tangible benefits: protection, access, and the ability to communicate with his outside network. Every interaction was measured, every gesture deliberate. Even under the strict scrutiny of the law, Luciano maintained his psychological advantage, demonstrating that true power was as much about perception and influence as it was about physical freedom. Within prison, Luciano continued to oversee the operations of his criminal empire. He relied on trusted lieutenants on the outside to manage day-to-day activities, issuing instructions through coded messages, intermediaries, and carefully cultivated channels of communication. His ability to maintain authority across distance and confinement revealed the sophistication of the network he had built. It was resilient, disciplined, and adaptive, capable of functioning even when its architect was physically removed from the streets. This capacity for control under adversity reinforced the notion that Luciano's genius was not merely in acquisition or enforcement, but in the systems, structures, and psychological levers he had established. The prison environment also tested Luciano's capacity for patience and long-term thinking. He recognized that immediate action was often impossible, that survival and influence required subtlety, timing, and strategic restraint. He observed, calculated, and waited for the right moments to act, whether to strengthen alliances, manipulate rivals, or prepare for opportunities that lay beyond the prison walls. This discipline, born from years of navigating the unpredictable chaos of the criminal underworld, became even more critical in a confined environment where impulsive action could prove fatal. Psychologically, Luciano transformed imprisonment into a demonstration of his enduring power. Rumors of his influence, carefully disseminated through both inmates and external contacts, reinforced his myth. The perception of his untouchability persisted, demonstrating that true authority did not depend on immediate presence but on the careful orchestration of relationships, fear, and respect. Even those who had once been skeptical of his abilities came to recognize that the mind of Luciano could extend far beyond the physical limitations of confinement. While incarcerated, Luciano also began to engage with broader networks that intersected with government and political spheres. Through intermediaries and carefully cultivated connections, he offered insight, advice, and strategic cooperation, demonstrating that even in prison he could wield influence over decisions that affected national security and organized crime alike. These maneuvers were subtle, calculated, and often invisible to the public, yet they highlighted his capacity to operate across multiple domains simultaneously: criminal, political, and social, further solidifying his status as a strategist whose reach exceeded conventional boundaries. Luciano's adaptability in prison revealed the full extent of his genius. He maintained control without resorting to constant intimidation, relying instead on psychological insight, strategic alliances, and an unshakable reputation. His ability to influence events from behind bars transformed perceptions of power, proving that even physical confinement could not neutralize a mind capable of understanding and manipulating complex systems of human behavior. It was a testament to his foresight, discipline, and unwavering ability to convert limitations into advantages. Moreover, prison life did not diminish Luciano's capacity for long-term planning. He used the time to reflect, to consolidate relationships, and to strategize the next phase of his empire. Every decision, every interaction, was filtered through the lens of survival, influence, and opportunity. By mastering the social, political, and psychological dynamics of incarceration, Luciano ensured that he remained a central figure in organized crime, even as he navigated the vulnerability inherent in being physically restrained. Ultimately, this period solidified Luciano's reputation as a man who could never be fully contained. His empire continued to function, his influence persisted, and his name remained synonymous with intelligence, strategy, and untouchable authority. From within prison walls, he demonstrated that true power was as much about the mind and perception as it was about freedom or force. His ability to operate under such constraints underscored the depth of his strategic genius and ensured that, even in apparent defeat, Luciano's empire, influence, and legend would endure. Luciano's eventual deportation to Italy marked the beginning of the final, transformative chapter of his life. A phase that tested not only his adaptability but also his understanding of power, identity, and legacy. For a man who had thrived on control, influence, and the orchestration of vast criminal networks, exile was a profound challenge. Italy was both familiar and foreign, a place where he had roots but lacked the dominance he had established in New York. Yet, true to his nature, Luciano approached exile not as an endpoint, but as a strategic pivot, a space in which he could reimagine his role in the criminal and political landscape while reconciling with the limitations imposed upon him. Upon arrival, he quickly assessed the environment, noting the political climate, the presence of rival factions, and the opportunities available for influence. Though removed from the direct operations of his American empire, Luciano leveraged his reputation and connections to maintain a foothold in international organized crime. Correspondents, emissaries, and loyal associates ensured that he could continue to direct, advise, and, when necessary, negotiate with factions that had once been fully under his control. Exile, rather than diminishing his power, forced him to rely on intelligence, persuasion, and strategy over brute force, reinforcing the cerebral nature of his influence. The Italian landscape offered both opportunities and constraints. Luciano's prominence drew attention from local authorities and rival criminals alike, yet he navigated this environment with the same strategic foresight that had defined his career in America. He cultivated alliances, managed conflicts through negotiation, and subtly manipulated political and criminal networks to preserve his influence. Even in exile, he remained a figure of respect, fear, and fascination. His ability to adapt, to operate within constraints, and to extend influence across borders highlighted a level of resilience and ingenuity few could match. Exile also offered a period of reflection. For the first time in decades, Luciano had the temporal distance to consider the consequences of his actions, the structure of his empire, and the human costs associated with his rise to power. He witnessed the lives of former associates, observed the fragility of networks he had built, and began to recognize the shifting dynamics of global organized crime. This introspection did not diminish his ambition, but it deepened his understanding of strategy, loyalty, and the nature of human behavior. Luciano's exile became not a retreat, but a laboratory in which he could test influence, refine strategy, and maintain relevance despite physical separation from his empire. During this period, Luciano also engaged with international politics in subtle but significant ways. World events, including the aftermath of World War II, created opportunities for influence, negotiation, and intervention that extended beyond criminal networks. Luciano demonstrated a keen understanding of geopolitical dynamics, recognizing how alliances, intelligence, and diplomacy could serve his long-term interests. His ability to navigate complex political landscapes reflected a maturity and adaptability that surpassed his earlier streetwise cunning, showing that his genius was not confined to local or immediate concerns but could operate on a global scale. At the same time, Luciano's personal life evolved. He became more introspective, less concerned with public displays of power, and more focused on the subtle maintenance of influence. The isolation of exile forced him to confront aspects of his identity previously overshadowed by ambition and empire building. He reflected on the choices that had brought him both extraordinary success and profound vulnerability, considering how reputation, perception, and legacy intertwined with mortality. This period, though constrained, enriched his understanding of power not just as control over others, but as the ability to endure, adapt, and remain relevant across contexts. Despite physical displacement, Luciano remained a force in organized crime. He coordinated operations through intermediaries, maintained communication with key figures in the United States, and continued to influence the structure and strategy of organized crime on both sides of the Atlantic. His empire had transformed from one based solely on territorial control and direct enforcement into a sophisticated network sustained by perception, loyalty, and strategic communication. Even in exile, Luciano's capacity to shape outcomes, manipulate alliances, and enforce authority underscored his enduring brilliance as a strategist and tactician. Exile also highlighted the limits of human ambition. Luciano experienced firsthand that power, no matter how absolute it appears, is contingent on context, geography, and perception. His ability to adapt and influence across distance became his defining skill in these years, but he was acutely aware that his empire's foundations in America were vulnerable to shifts in loyalty, enforcement, and circumstance. This realization instilled a tempered perspective, blending ambition with caution, audacity with reflection. Ultimately, this period in Italy served as both a coda and a crucible for Luciano's life. Deprived of the immediate tools of dominance, guns, territory, and the proximity of power, he demonstrated that influence and strategy could transcend confinement and exile. Luciano's ability to maintain relevance, command respect, and navigate complex networks of loyalty and ambition underscored the cerebral nature of his authority. He had become a master not just of organized crime, but of adaptation, perception, and enduring influence, proving that true power is as much about the mind, foresight, and subtle manipulation as it is about immediate control. By the end of his years in exile, Luciano's life had been transformed from one defined by relentless expansion and ruthless enforcement into a study of resilience, adaptability, and strategic endurance. His empire had been tested, constrained, and partially removed from his direct control, yet his influence endured, his reputation remained formidable, and his understanding of power deepened. Exile, far from being a simple punishment, became the final demonstration of Luciano's genius, a testament to a mind capable of sustaining authority, shaping human behavior, and remaining untouchable even in the most challenging and unfamiliar circumstances. The legacy of Lucky Luciano is one of complexity, paradox, and enduring influence. While many of his contemporaries were remembered for acts of sheer violence, impulsive ambition, or fleeting notoriety, Luciano's mark on organized crime was structural, psychological, and enduring. He transformed what had been a chaotic, fragmented underworld into a disciplined, interconnected system of operations that combined strategy, loyalty, and perception. His genius lay not simply in the accumulation of wealth or power, but in the creation of a framework that could survive, adapt, and thrive even in the face of disruption. In this way, Luciano's legacy transcended the era in which he lived, leaving an imprint that would define organized crime for generations. Central to his influence was the institutionalization of organized crime. Before Luciano, mafia operations in America were often localized, impulsive, and disorganized, prone to destructive internal conflicts and vulnerable to law enforcement intervention. Luciano introduced structure, hierarchy, and systematic coordination. He created networks that spanned cities, states, and eventually international borders, ensuring that criminal enterprises could operate efficiently while minimizing unnecessary conflict. The establishment of the Commission, a governing body for the mafia, epitomized this vision, offering a forum for dispute resolution, strategic planning, and collective governance. Luciano's approach demonstrated that criminal activity could be managed with the same rigor and sophistication as legitimate business enterprises, blending intelligence with ruthlessness in a model that would influence organized crime for decades. Psychologically, Luciano's legacy was equally profound. He understood the human element at a level unmatched by his peers, recognizing that loyalty, fear, ambition, and ego could be harnessed as tools of control. Through calculated incentives, subtle manipulation, and the enforcement of omerta, he maintained cohesion within his organization while projecting power externally. This mastery of human behavior became a blueprint for criminal leadership, showing that dominance was not achieved solely through violence, but through strategy, foresight, and the ability to manipulate perception. In essence, Luciano demonstrated that psychological acumen could be as decisive as physical force in maintaining an empire. Luciano's impact also reshaped the relationship between organized crime and the broader society. By institutionalizing operations and minimizing internecine violence, he made the mafia more resilient and less chaotic, creating an organization capable of long-term influence over politics, labor, and business. His operations intersected with legitimate enterprises, labor unions, and even government agencies, blurring the lines between legality and criminality in ways that would challenge authorities for decades. The systems he built were resilient not only because of their efficiency, but because they exploited human tendencies, ambition, fear, and loyalty, to ensure compliance, maintain secrecy, and manage risk. Luciano's strategic vision transformed the mafia from a reactive force into a proactive, adaptive, and highly sophisticated institution. Yet, Luciano's legacy is not without contradiction. He was a man of unparalleled intellect and foresight, yet he operated outside the bounds of law and morality, leaving a trail of violence, betrayal, and personal devastation. Allies and rivals alike were shaped by his decisions. Some empowered, some destroyed. The duality of his life, strategic brilliance and ruthless ambition, loyalty and betrayal, vision and violence, underscores the complexity of his character and the depth of his influence. To understand Luciano is to understand that power, when exercised with intellect and precision, can be transformative, but it is rarely benign. In historical terms, Luciano's influence extended far beyond New York or the United States. The model of organized crime he developed, centralized governance, psychological manipulation, strategic alliances, and institutionalized operations, served as a template for criminal networks worldwide. Figures in Europe, South America, and beyond studied and adapted his methods, recognizing the efficacy of a system that combined strategy, loyalty, and fear. Luciano's ideas about organization, governance, and influence were as revolutionary in the criminal world as any corporate restructuring in legitimate business, emphasizing foresight, adaptability, and the long-term management of power. Culturally, Luciano became a symbol, mythologized in films, literature, and public imagination. He represented both the allure and the danger of intelligence deployed without moral constraint. The narrative of the brilliant gangster, the untouchable strategist, and the man who could manipulate allies, rivals, and law enforcement alike captured the public imagination, creating a legend that continues to resonate. Yet beneath the myth lay the tangible results of his strategies: a durable criminal infrastructure, enduring influence over organized crime, and lessons in human psychology and leadership that transcended the world of crime entirely. Luciano's legacy is also evident in the ways modern organized crime operates. The concepts of disciplined hierarchy, centralized control, interfamily governance, and strategic negotiation all trace back to the structures he established. Even contemporary law enforcement strategies are in many ways responses to the systems he created, illustrating the depth and reach of his influence. By transforming an inherently unstable and violent environment into a managed, adaptive network, Luciano left a blueprint for organized crime that is studied, adapted, and understood long after his death. Ultimately, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is a testament to the power of intellect, strategy, and psychological mastery. He demonstrated that dominance is as much about foresight, manipulation, and structure as it is about force or intimidation. Through innovation, ruthlessness, and insight into human behavior, he shaped not only the criminal underworld of his time but the very principles of organized crime for generations to come. His life remains a study in contrasts: genius and brutality, loyalty and betrayal, empire and exile. In examining Luciano's legacy, one sees the enduring impact of a man who was not merely a criminal, but a strategist, an architect, and an enduring symbol of calculated power. In the end, the story of Lucky Luciano does not fade with the echo of gunfire or the shattering of an empire. It dissolves slowly, like smoke curling above a street lamp at dawn, fragile yet persistent, drifting upward long after the match has burned itself out. Power, true power, rarely ends with a roar. More often, it slips quietly into memory, carried by the whispers of those who lived under its shadow. And for a man like Lucky Luciano, whose life had been defined by strategy, perception, and psychological control, the final chapter was not a downfall, but a long, contemplative fade into the twilight of reflection, consequence, and legacy that outlived the beat of his own heart. He had survived the streets, survived betrayal, survived rivals, survived prison, survived exile. But no one survives time. In the fading decades of his life, Luciano discovered a truth he had never allowed himself to confront during his brutal rise: that the greatest battles are not fought with bullets or alliances, but with memory, regret, and the fragile mirror of one's own conscience. He had built a kingdom out of fear and loyalty, crafted a myth from intellect and ruthlessness, and played the game of power with a precision that reshaped the very architecture of organized crime. But in exile, far from New York's towering skyline and the pulse of its streets, he was left alone with the echo of decisions that could no longer be outrun. Italy was a strange land for him, familiar in blood, foreign in reality. The cities, thick with ancient history, carried none of the rhythm he knew. The language rolled naturally off his tongue, but the streets did not recognize him. Italy was not a place where he had earned power. It was a place where he had been placed like a pawn removed from the board, set aside, disconnected from the very empire he had once ruled with invisible threads. Yet even here in this land of exile, Luciano's name carried weight. Not the weight of authority but the weight of myth, a presence that hovered around him, undeniable and permanent, like the shadow of a monument carved too deeply to be erased. He lived in modest surroundings, far removed from the lavish apartments and hidden meeting rooms of New York. His days were marked by routine: reading newspapers, speaking with distant associates, walking through narrow streets where no one dared approach him unless he allowed it. And yet the myth followed him. Young men whispered his name in bars, pointing at grainy photographs in foreign newspapers. Police monitored him, not because he was committing crimes, but because he was Lucky Luciano, because the ghost of his influence was enough to make governments uneasy. His reputation had become a creature of its own, slipping through borders, outliving relevance, sustained by stories that grew with each retelling. In these quiet years, far from the chaos he once orchestrated, Luciano finally faced the one adversary he could never outsmart: himself. In New York he had always been moving forward, always 2 steps ahead, always analyzing, calculating, anticipating. There had been no time to wonder about morality or consequence. Decisions had been made by necessity, survival, and vision. But exile slowed him, forced him into stillness, pushed him into reflection. And reflection is a dangerous enemy for men who built their lives on shadows. At night, when the world went silent and the streets of Naples echoed with the distant hum of a city settling into sleep, Luciano would sit alone by his window, listening to the sounds of life unfolding below, a life he could observe but no longer shape. He was a man who once pulled strings that stretched across America, controlling unions, politicians, gambling rings, and entire criminal dynasties. Now he pulled nothing but memories from the deep well of his past. He thought of his childhood, of the boy who arrived in New York with nothing but hunger for survival, hunger for respect, hunger for power. He thought of the Lower East Side with its cramped tenements and brutal lessons. He thought of friends who had become brothers and brothers who had become enemies. He thought of every choice that had carved the path beneath his feet, leading him from street corners to boardrooms, from squalor to influence, from anonymity to legend. And he wondered, quietly, if any of it had truly belonged to him, or if he had simply been swept along by forces greater than himself, ambition, fear, destiny. For the first time in his life, he questioned the narrative that had defined him. Did I shape the world? Or did the world shape me? In these reflections, a truth emerged, a truth he had never spoken aloud, perhaps never even admitted to himself. That power, no matter how absolute, is fragile. It is borrowed, not owned. It is built on the obedience of others, on the illusion of invincibility, on the stories people tell about you when you are not in the room. And like all illusions, it fades when its architect steps away. Luciano had once commanded armies of men through nothing but his name, a name spoken with fear, respect, and sometimes awe. Now that name lingered in the air not as an order, but as a memory. And yet memory, he realized, was its own kind of power. Because memory outlasts fear. Memory outlasts loyalty. Memory outlasts life. In exile, he watched the underworld he had shaped evolve. The new generation was more reckless, more violent, less disciplined. They fought over scraps, ignored the commission, broke rules he had written with blood and strategy. The delicate structure he had built, one of balance, negotiation, and shared interest, had begun to warp under the weight of greed and short-sighted ambition. The new mobsters did not understand psychology. They did not understand perception. They did not understand that true power is invisible. They mistook brutality for control, mistook noise for authority, mistook fear for dominance. Luciano saw it all from afar, and he felt something unexpected. Not anger, not longing, but a deep, weary disappointment. These men had inherited his blueprint but not his vision. They had the architecture but not the intellect to maintain it. They broke alliances out of impatience, escalated violence out of ego, and destroyed stability because they had never experienced the chaos from which he had risen. They had not lived through the era of unregulated bloodshed, the years of inter-family wars, the senseless killings that had nearly torn New York apart. They did not understand the cost of order because they had been born into it. And so, Luciano became the silent observer of a world drifting away from him, a world he had forged but could no longer steer. In his isolation, he developed a strange relationship with memory. Some days, memory was a refuge, a place where he could visit the past and find purpose in what he had built. Other days, memory was a torment, a reminder of decisions that could not be undone, of lives taken, of people betrayed, of opportunities lost to time. He saw faces in his mind, allies who had died young, men who had trusted him, rivals who had fallen under the weight of his strategies. He saw the victims too, the collateral damage of an empire built on shadows. And in these private moments, he felt the sting of a truth that had never touched him before. Even brilliant men leave scars. Yet despite these reflections, Luciano did not drown in regret. He was a realist to his core. He understood that life is shaped by circumstance, and that he had played the hand he had been dealt with extraordinary skill. He did not apologize for the man he had been. He did not hide from his past. He simply acknowledged it, every triumph, every crime, every decision, as a part of the strange, unrepeatable journey of a boy who had clawed his way to the top of a world that eats most men alive. And perhaps, in the quiet clarity of exile, he finally allowed himself to be human, not the untouchable strategist, not the feared Don, not the myth, but a man who had lived a life larger than most, and who carried the weight of that life in his fading years. His death, when it came, was ordinary. No gunman. No betrayals. No dramatic final showdown. He collapsed at the Naples airport after meeting with producers interested in making a film about his life. A fitting irony, perhaps, that his final moments were spent discussing the myth of himself. People rushed to help him, unaware of the magnitude of the man slipping away in their arms. For a figure who had commanded the underworld, who had shaped history in ways most never knew, it was a humble ending. But endings do not define legacies. Stories do. And Lucky Luciano's story, in the end, became something larger than the man himself. His life spread across continents in the form of whispers and cautionary tales. His strategies appeared in criminal networks he had never visited. His influence drifted into boardrooms, political backchannels, and international smuggling rings. His name became shorthand for intelligence, for organization, for power executed with precision rather than chaos. People argued about him. Historians debated his importance. Journalists exaggerated his influence. Filmmakers romanticized his image. Young criminals idolized him. Governments feared the systems he created long after he was gone. His myth became a living creature, constantly evolving, reshaping itself, adapting to each new generation's fascination with the forbidden, the powerful, the brilliant, the dangerous. But beneath all the mythology lies a quieter, more intimate truth, that Luciano was a symbol of what the human mind can achieve when driven by survival, shaped by hardship, and fueled by an unrelenting desire to rise above circumstance. He was flawed, ruthless, brilliant, contradictory. He was both the architect and the prisoner of his own empire. He was a man who walked willingly into darkness because the world had offered him no light. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human in his ambition, his brutality, his intelligence, and his contradictions. He embodied the extremes of the human experience, the potential for greatness and destruction that lives in all people, magnified through the lens of a life shaped by poverty, adversity, and the unforgiving streets of early 20th century America. In the end, Luciano's life is not simply a story of crime. It is a story of power, how it is built, how it is wielded, and how it inevitably slips from the hands of even the most brilliant strategist. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of vision and consequence, of myth and reality. It is a story that reminds us that every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, must eventually bow to time. But it is also a story of endurance. Because even after death, Luciano's name continued to ripple through history, a testament to the idea that the most powerful forces are sometimes those that cannot be touched, arrested, or exiled. Influence survives where the body cannot. Ideas outlive the man who first imagined them. And so the smoke rises. And the legend remains. Lucky Luciano, the untouchable strategist, exits the world not with noise but with silence. Not with violence but with memory. Not with power but with reflection. And long after his footsteps faded from the streets of New York and Naples alike, the imprint of his life remained etched into the world he left behind. A reminder that even in exile, even in death, the stories we create ripple onward, carried by time, transformed by memory, and immortalized by those who continue to whisper our names long after we are gone.